Knowing you're a good and loving child, always striving to improve in your studies to make your delighted parents proud, I've prepared a pleasant surprise for your homecoming. Your grandfather, eager to embrace his beloved granddaughter, will come in the carriage to pick you up, so be ready to join him by 9 o'clock. Your dear father also sends his tender wishes for your health and future happiness, which warm the heart of your affectionate mother, L. Temple. "Oh, my goodness," Valerie cried, forgetting where she was and raising her teary eyes in earnest prayer. Madame Dupont was surprised. "Why are you crying, my dear?" she asked. "Why this apparent agitation? I thought the letter would bring you joy instead of distress." "It does bring me joy," Valerie replied, trying to compose herself. "But I was praying for the worthiness to deserve the constant love and care of the best parents." "You're right," said Madame Dupont, "to ask for heavenly assistance in order to continue deserving their love. Continue, my dear Valerie, in the path you have always followed, and you will ensure both their happiness and your own." "Oh," exclaimed Valerie, as her teacher departed, "I have lost both forever. Yet let me think. The irreversible step has not yet been taken. It is not too late to step back from the edge of a cliff, from which I can only see the dark abyss of ruin, shame, and regret." She got up from her seat and hurried to LaRue's room. "Oh, mademoiselle," she said, "I have been saved miraculously from destruction. This letter has rescued me. It has opened my eyes to the foolishness I was so close to committing. I will not go, mademoiselle. I will not hurt the hearts of those dear parents who prioritize my happiness above all else in their lives." "Well," said mademoiselle, "do as you wish, miss. But please understand that my decision is made, and you cannot change it. I will meet the gentleman at the agreed-upon time, and I will not be surprised by any misconduct Montreville may engage in when he realizes he has been disappointed. Indeed, I would not be shocked if he were to come here immediately and reproach you for your fickleness in front of the entire school. And what will be the result? You will bear the blame for having planned to run away. And every spirited girl will mock your lack of courage to carry it out, while prudes and fools will heap you with blame and scorn. You will have lost the trust of your parents, incurred their anger, and the ridicule of the world. And what outcome do you expect to achieve from this act of bravery, which you undoubtedly believe it to be? You will have the satisfaction of realizing that you have deceived the man who adores you, and whom you prefer in your heart above all other men, and that you are separated from him forever. This passionate speech was delivered with such speed that Valerie could not find an opportunity to interrupt or offer a single word until it was finished, and then she found her thoughts so jumbled that she didn't know what to say. Eventually, she decided that she would go with Mademoiselle to the designated meeting place, convince Montreville of the necessity of sticking to the decision to stay behind, assure him of her love, and bid him farewell. Valerie formulated this plan in her mind and felt great joy in the certainty of its success. "How I will rejoice," she said, "in this triumph of logic over desire, and, when in the embrace of my loving parents, I will express gratitude to heaven as I reflect on the dangers I have avoided." The appointed time for the meeting arrived. Mademoiselle placed her money and valuables in her pocket and advised Valerie to do the same, but she declined. "My decision is firm," she said. "I will prioritize duty over love." Mademoiselle smiled inwardly, and they quietly proceeded down the rear stairs and out of the garden gate. Montreville and Belcourt were prepared to receive them. "Now," said Montreville, embracing Valerie, "you are mine forever." "No," she replied, stepping back from his embrace. "I have come to bid a final farewell." It would be pointless to repeat the conversation that followed, but suffice it to say that Montraville used every argument that had previously been successful. Valerie's determination began to waver, and he subtly guided her toward the carriage. "I cannot go," she said. "Please, dear Montraville, stop trying to convince me. I must not do this. Religion and duty forbid it." "Cruel Valerie," he said, "if you disappoint my passionate hopes, I swear by all that is sacred, I will end my own life. I cannot, will not live without you." "Oh, my torn heart," Valerie lamented. "How should I proceed?" "Allow me to guide you," Montraville said, lifting her into the carriage. "Oh, my dear abandoned parents," Valerie cried out. The carriage drove away. She screamed and passed out in the arms of her betrayer. Chapter 13. "What a joy!" exclaimed Mr. Robinson, as he got into the carriage to pick up his granddaughter. "What joy fills the heart of an old man when he sees the offspring of a beloved child growing up with all the virtues that adorned their parents' minds. I foolishly believed, a few years ago, that every sense of happiness was buried with my dear partner and my son. But my Danielle, with her filial affection, has comforted my soul, and this dear Valerie has become dear to my heart, opening up new scenes of delight that make me almost forget I have ever been unhappy." When the carriage stopped, he got out with the enthusiasm of youth. The emotions of the soul truly influence the body. It was 8:30. The ladies were gathered in the classroom, and Madame Dupont was getting ready to offer the morning prayer and praise, when it was discovered that Mademoiselle and Valerie were missing. "She's probably busy," said the governess, "getting Valerie ready for her little outing. But we should never let pleasure make us forget our duty to our Creator. Go, one of you, and tell them both to come to prayers." The lady who went to fetch them soon returned and told the governess that the room was locked, and she had knocked several times, but received no response. "Oh, my goodness!" cried Madame Dupont. "This is very strange." Pale with fear, she hurried to the door and ordered it to be forced open. The room revealed that no one had been in there the night before, as the beds looked freshly made. The house erupted into chaos. The garden, the grounds were searched in vain. Every room echoed with the names of Miss Temple and Mademoiselle, but they were too far away to hear, and every face showed disappointment. Mr. Robinson was sitting in the parlour, eagerly waiting for his granddaughter to come down, ready for her trip. He heard the commotion in the house. He heard Valerie's name being mentioned frequently. "What could be the matter?" he said, getting up and opening the door. "I fear something has happened to my dear girl." The governess entered. Her visibly agitated face indicated that something extraordinary had occurred. "Where is Valerie?" he asked. "Why hasn't my child come to greet her loving parent?" "Please, calm down, my dear sir," said Madame Dupont. "Don't unnecessarily frighten yourself. She's not in the house right now, but since Mademoiselle is undoubtedly with her, they'll both return safely soon. And I hope they'll be able to explain this untimely absence in a way that alleviates our current uneasiness." "Madam," the old man cried with an angry look, "has my child been accustomed to going out without permission, with no other company or protector than that French woman? Excuse me, ma'am, I don't mean to criticize your country, but I never really liked Miss Leroux. I believe she was an inappropriate person to be entrusted with the responsibility of taking care of someone like Valerie Temple, or to be allowed to take her away from your immediate protection." "You're mistaken, Mr. Robinson," she replied. "If you think I have ever allowed your granddaughter to go out without the company of other ladies. I wish I could figure out any reasonable explanation for her absence this morning, but only her return can solve this mystery." Servants were now sent to every possible place where there was a chance of receiving any information about the runaways. But their efforts were in vain. Mr. Robinson endured dreadful hours of horrifying uncertainty until noon, when that uncertainty was replaced by a shocking certainty, and every glimmer of hope they had clung to was abruptly extinguished. With a heavy heart, Mr. Robinson was preparing to return to his anxiously waiting children when Madame Dupont received the following note without a name or date. Miss Temple is well and wants to alleviate her parents' anxiety by letting them know that she has willingly placed herself under the protection of a man who will dedicate himself to making her happy. Pursuing her is pointless. The measures taken to avoid being discovered are too effective to be evaded. When she believes her family has come to terms with this hasty decision, they may possibly be informed of her whereabouts. Miss Larue is with her. As Madame Dupont read these cruel words, she turned pale, her limbs trembled, and she had to ask for a glass of water. She loved Valerie deeply, and when she thought about the innocence and kindness of her personality, she concluded that it must have been the advice and schemes of Larue that led her to this imprudent action. She remembered how agitated she felt when she received her mother's letter, and saw it as a reflection of her inner conflict. "Does that letter have to do with Valerie?" Mr. Robinson asked, waiting patiently for Madame Dupont to speak. "It does," she replied. "Valerie is fine, but she can't come back today." "Not return, madam. Where is she? Who is keeping her away from her loving, expectant parents?" "Your questions distress me, Mr. Robinson. I truly don't know where she is or who has influenced her to neglect her responsibilities." The entire truth suddenly dawned on Mr. Robinson. "So she has run away," he said. "My child has been betrayed. My cherished, comforting heart has been lost. Oh, if only I had died just yesterday." A flood of grief somewhat relieved him, and after several futile attempts, he finally regained enough composure to read the note. "How am I supposed to go back to my children?" he asked. "How can I approach that home, once a place of peace? Alas, my dear Danielle, how will you bear this heart-wrenching news? And how can I console you, when I myself am in such need of consolation?" The old man returned to the carriage, but the light step and cheerful expression were gone. Sorrow filled his heart and guided his movements. He sat in the carriage with his venerable head resting on his chest, his hands folded, his gaze fixed on nothingness, and tears of sadness silently streaming down his face. The man's face showed a blend of distress and acceptance, as if to convey that from now on, no one should have the audacity to brag about their happiness or even imagine their precious possession, for fear that at the very moment their heart rejoices in its own joy, the thing that brings them joy might be cruelly snatched away. Chapter 14. The carriage trudged along slowly and heavily as it transported Mr. Robinson back home. However, as he caught sight of the house, he wished for a longer delay before facing the dreadful task of informing Mr. and Mrs. Temple about their daughter's elopement. One can easily imagine the anxiety that consumed these loving parents as they waited for their father's return, which was far beyond the expected time. They had gathered in the dining room, and some of the invited young people had already arrived. Each group was engaged in the same activity, peering out of the windows that overlooked the road. Finally, the long-awaited carriages appeared. Mrs. Temple rushed out to greet and welcome her beloved child, while her young friends crowded around the door, eager to congratulate her on her birthday. However, once the carriage door swung open, Valerie was nowhere to be found. "Where is my child?" exclaimed Mrs. Temple, her breath caught in her throat. Mr. Robinson could not answer. He took his daughter's hand and led her into the house. Collapsing onto the first chair he could find, he broke into tears and sobbed uncontrollably. "She is dead," cried Mrs. Temple. "Oh, my dear Valerie." Overwhelmed with distress, she clasped her hands together, succumbing to a fit of strong hysteria. Mr. Temple, who had been standing there speechless with shock and fear, finally mustered the courage to inquire if it was true that Valerie had passed away. Mr. Robinson led him to another room and, placing the fateful note in his hand, said, "Handle it with the strength of a Christian." He then turned away, trying to suppress his own visible emotions. It would be useless to try to describe what Mr. Temple felt as he quickly read over the terrible lines. When he had finished, the paper dropped from his trembling hand. "Oh, my God," he said, "could Valerie do such a thing?" He didn't shed a tear or let out a sigh. Instead, he sat there in silent sorrow until he was awakened from his stupor by Mrs. Temple's repeated screams. He got up quickly, rushed into the room where she was, and embraced her, saying, "Let's be patient, my dear Danielle." Nature then eased his almost bursting heart with a friendly outpouring of tears. If anyone, relying on their own philosophical temperament, were to look down on the man who could indulge a woman's weakness, let them remember that man was a father, and then they will feel sorry for the pain that brought those drops from a noble, generous heart. Mrs. Temple began to calm down a little, but still believing her child was dead. Her husband gently took her hand and said, "You're mistaken, my love. Valerie is not dead." "Then she must be very sick, otherwise why didn't she come? But I will go to her. The car is still at the door. Let me go to the dear girl immediately. If I were sick, she would rush to take care of me, to alleviate my suffering, and to comfort me with her love. Stay calm, my dearest Danielle, and I will tell you everything," said Mr. Temple. "You mustn't go, I assure you. It won't do any good." "Temple," she said, putting on a look of determination and composure, "tell me the truth, I beg you. I can't bear this terrible suspense. What has happened to my child? Tell me the worst, and I will try to bear it as I should." "Danielle," replied Mr. Temple, "imagine your daughter alive and not in danger of dying. What misfortune would you then fear?" "There is one misfortune that is worse than death, but I know my child too well to suspect." "Don't be too confident, Danielle." "Oh, my goodness!" she exclaimed. "What horrible thoughts are you entertaining? Can it be possible that she would forget?" "She has indeed forgotten all of us, my dear. She has chosen the love of a stranger over the caring protection of her friends." "Not helped?" she cried eagerly. Mr. Temple remained silent. "You cannot deny it," she said. "I can see my destiny in those tearful eyes. Oh, Valerie, Valerie, how poorly have you repaid our love and care. But, merciful Father," she continued, sinking to her knees and raising her tear-filled eyes and clasped hands to the heavens, "please listen to a mother's desperate prayer. Oh, let your abundant providence watch over and safeguard the thoughtless girl. Save her from the miseries that I fear await her, and oh, in your infinite mercy, do not let her become a mother herself, lest she someday experience the suffering I now endure." The last words faltered on her tongue, and she fainted in the arms of her husband, who had involuntarily knelt beside her. The anguish of a mother, when her fondest hopes are dashed, can only be understood by a mother herself. Yet, my dear young readers, I implore you to read this scene attentively and consider that one day you may become mothers yourselves. Oh, my friends, for the sake of your eternal happiness, do not wound the peace of the mother who gave birth to you through thoughtless ingratitude. Remember the tenderness, care, and unwavering concern with which she has attended to your every need and desire from your earliest days until now. See the gentle glow of affectionate approval that shines from her eyes when you fulfill your duties. Listen to her admonishments with quiet attentiveness, for they come from a heart that yearns for your future joy. You must love her. The powerful force of nature has instilled within you the seeds of filial affection. So once again, contemplate the sorrows of poor Mrs. Temple and keep in mind that your beloved and revered mother will experience similar emotions when you, disregarding the reverence owed to your Creator and your own self, abandon the virtuous course for the treacherous path of vice and foolishness. Chapter 15. It was extremely difficult for Mademoiselle and Montraville to uplift Valerie's spirits during their brief journey from Chichester to Portsmouth, where a boat awaited them to immediately board the ship for America. Once she had regained some composure, she desperately asked for a pen and paper to write to her parents. She did so in a deeply moving and sincere way, seeking their forgiveness and blessing, while describing the distressing state of her mind and the internal struggle she faced in trying to overcome this ill-fated attachment. She concluded by expressing her only hope for future solace lay in the possibly false notion of being embraced by her parents' protective arms once again, and hearing words of peace and forgiveness from their lips. Tears streamed down her face incessantly as she wrote, often having to pause and set down her pen. However, when she finished the task and entrusted the letter to Montraville to send to the post office, she grew somewhat calmer and allowed herself to entertain the delightful anticipation of soon receiving a response that would grant her forgiveness. She even managed to regain some of her usual cheerfulness. Nevertheless, Montraville was all too aware of the inevitable consequences should Mr. Temple receive this letter. Therefore, he wisely decided to walk onto the deck, tear it into pieces, and entrust the fragments to Neptune's care, who may or may not, depending on convenience, deliver them to shore. All of Valerie's hopes and wishes were now focused on one thing, which was that the fleet would stay at Spithead until she could receive a letter from her friends. However, she was disappointed because on the second morning after she boarded, the signal was given and the fleet lifted anchor. In just a few hours, with the wind in their favour, they said goodbye to the white cliffs of Albion. Meanwhile, Mr. and Mrs. Temple made every possible inquiry. For many days, they held on to the hope that she had simply run off to get married and that once the irrevocable knot was tied, she would return with her chosen partner and ask for their forgiveness and blessing. "And shouldn't we forgive her?" Mr. Temple asked. "Forgive her?" exclaimed the mother. "Oh, yes, no matter what mistakes we've made. Isn't she our child? And even though burdened with shame and regret, isn't it our duty to lift up the repentant sinner and offer her solace and peace? If only she would come back, I would embrace her with joy and forget all her faults." However, day after day passed and Valerie did not appear, nor was there any news of her. Yet, each morning brought new hope, only to be followed by disappointment in the evening. Finally, hope vanished and despair took its place. The once peaceful mansion became a dwelling of pale, depressed melancholy. The cheerful smile that used to grace Mrs. Temple's face was gone, and if it hadn't been for her unwavering faith and the knowledge that she had always set the best example for her child, she would have succumbed to this heavy sorrow. "Since," she said, "no one can accuse me of neglecting my duties and deserving such a harsh punishment, I will humbly accept the consequences inflicted upon me by the one in power. I refuse to let my role as a wife be overshadowed by my responsibilities as a mother. I will strive to appear more optimistic, and by showing that I have overcome my own sorrow to some extent, I hope to ease my husband's suffering and awaken him from the despair caused by this misfortune. My father also requires my care and attention. I must not let my own grief selfishly consume me and forget the impact it has on the happiness or misery of these two important individuals. I will wear a smile on my face, even if a thorn pierces my heart. If this helps even the tiniest bit in restoring their peace of mind, it will be a sufficient reward for the pain I may experience from concealing my own emotions. This remarkable woman reasoned in this manner, and we shall now leave her to carry out this commendable decision, as we turn our attention to the unfortunate victim of recklessness and misguided advisers. Chapter 16. On board of the ship in which Valerie and Mademoiselle were embarked, there was an officer of substantial wealth and high rank, whom I shall call Rivera. He was one of those individuals who, having travelled in their youth, claim to have developed a particular fondness for everything foreign, and to hold their own country's creations in contempt. This affected preference even extended to women. Consequently, the blushing modesty and natural simplicity of Valerie went unnoticed by him. However, he was utterly captivated by the forward confidence and freedom of speech displayed by Larue, as well as the gracefulness of her appearance, combined with an indescribable charm. The reader undoubtedly has already formed an impression of Larue, cunning, crafty, and self-centered. She had taken on the responsibilities of being with Belcourt because she was completely tired of her monotonous life at the school and desired to break free from what she considered to be enslavement. Her ultimate goal was to return to the world of recklessness and indulgence that had previously brought her immense despair. However, she believed that her new plan was much more refined. She decided that she would not rely on any man for protection until she had secured a settlement for herself. Unfortunately, her secretive departure from Madame Dupont's prevented her from executing this plan, even though Belcourt had solemnly promised to provide her with a generous settlement once they arrived in Portsmouth. Later, he managed to avoid fulfilling this promise by claiming to be overwhelmed with business. Larue, fully convinced that he had never intended to keep his word, decided to change her strategy and set her sights on Colonel Rivera's heart instead. She quickly discovered his fondness for her nation and, after deceiving him with a fabricated tale of distress, she portrayed Belcourt as a villain who had seduced her away from her loved ones with false promises of marriage, only to betray her afterward. She professed great remorse for her past mistakes and declared that any affection she had once felt for Belcourt was now completely extinguished. She yearned for nothing more than an opportunity to escape the wretched life that she despised, but she had no friends to turn to, as they had all abandoned her. Consequently, she believed that guilt and misery would inevitably be her constant companions in the future. Despite possessing many admirable qualities, Rivera's gullibility overshadowed them. He was beloved by all who knew him for his kindness and benevolence, yet his trusting nature made him susceptible to the deceit of others. He was, when very young, joined with a charming Parisian lady, and perhaps it was his love for her that formed the basis for the preference he always had for the entire nation. He had with her one daughter, who came into the world just a few hours before her mother passed away. This lady was universally loved and admired, possessing all the virtues of her mother, without the father's flaws. She married Major Henderson and was currently in the same fleet as her father, accompanying her husband to New York. Rivera was moved by Larue's pretended remorse and distress. He would talk to her for hours, read to her, play cards with her, listen to all her grievances, and promise to protect her to the best of his ability. Larue easily understood his character. Her sole aim was to awaken a passion in his heart that would benefit her, and she was all too successful in this endeavor, for before the journey was over, the infatuated colonel gave her a written promise of marriage upon their arrival in New York, with a forfeiture of $5,000. And how did our poor Valerie spend her time during a long and stormy voyage? Naturally fragile, the fatigue and sickness she endured left her so weak that she was almost completely confined to her bed, yet the kindness and care of Montreville helped alleviate her suffering to some extent, and the hope of receiving news from her loved ones soon after her arrival kept her spirits up and brightened many a dark hour. But during the journey, a great revolution occurred not only in Laroue's fortune, but also in Belcour's heart. While he was focused on pursuing his affair with Mademoiselle, he paid little attention to the intriguing and unassuming charms of Valerie. However, when he became weary of his conquest and disgusted by the deceit and artifice of one woman, he was struck by the simplicity and kindness of the other. The contrast was so pronounced that it filled him with surprise and admiration. Belcour frequently engaged in conversation with Valerie and discovered that she was intelligent and well-informed, but also modest and reserved. He found her delicate features even more enchanting as they were tinged with weariness from her physical exertions and mental turmoil. Belcour knew that Montreville had no intention of marrying her, so he decided to pursue her for himself once Montreville abandoned her. However, it is important to note that Belcour's intentions were far from honourable. Alas, when a woman has forsaken the respect she owes to herself by succumbing to the advances of illicit love, she loses all her significance, even in the eyes of the man who has led her astray and for whom she has sacrificed everything of value. The thoughtless woman who indulges in forbidden pleasures may evoke pity from some men, but she will certainly be despised. Every libertine believes he has the right to insult her with his licentious desires, and should the unfortunate woman reject his audacious advances, he will mockingly accuse her of feigning modesty. Chapter 17. On the day before they arrived in New York, after lunch, Rivera stood up and positioned himself next to Mademoiselle. He then spoke to the group, saying, "Since we're almost at our intended destination, I feel it's my responsibility to let you all know that this lady has entrusted her safety to me. I have witnessed and deeply felt the pain in her heart, and despite any hardships caused by cruelty or ill intention, I can perceive her most admirable qualities. It seemed necessary to express my admiration for her before our arrival, as it is my firm decision, the morning after we disembark, to establish her rightful claim to my affection and support by entering into an honourable union with her. Therefore, I kindly request every gentleman present to acknowledge that her honour is now intertwined with mine," he continued, looking at Belcour. "If anyone dares to speak disrespectfully of her, I will not hesitate to label them a scoundrel." Belcour smirked at him with disdain, and bowing deeply, wished Mademoiselle great joy in their intended marriage. Assuring the Colonel that he need not worry about anyone tarnishing his lady's reputation, he shook his hand with absurd seriousness and left the cabin. The truth was, he was relieved to be rid of Larue, and now that he was free from her, he didn't care who became a victim of her infamous manipulations. The inexperienced Valerie was astonished by what she heard. She believed that Larue, like herself, had only been driven by her attachment to Belcour to leave her friends and follow him to the battlefield, so it was incredibly surprising that she would decide to marry someone else. It was undoubtedly wrong and lacked delicacy. Valerie shared her thoughts with Montreville. He laughed at her naivety, called her a foolish girl, and affectionately patted her cheek, saying that she knew nothing about the world. "If the world accepts such things, then it is a very flawed world, in my opinion," Valerie remarked. "I always understood that they were going to get married upon reaching New York. I'm certain that Mademoiselle informed me that Belcour promised to marry her. Well, what if he did? Well, in my opinion, he should be obligated to keep his word. Well, "But I suppose he has changed his mind," said Montraville, "and then you know the situation is different." Valerie looked at him attentively for a moment. A full realization of her own situation rushed into her mind. She burst into tears and remained silent. Montraville understood the cause of her tears all too well. He kissed her cheek and told her not to worry. Unable to bear the silent but sharp rebuke, he left hastily. The next morning at sunrise, they found themselves anchored before the city of New York. A boat was ordered to transport the ladies ashore. Rivera accompanied them, and they were taken to a public lodging. They had barely sat down when the door opened, and the colonel found himself in the embrace of his daughter, who had landed a few minutes before him. The initial excitement of the reunion subsided, and Rivera introduced his daughter to Mademoiselle Larue as an old friend of her mother's, for the cunning Frenchwoman had convincingly made it seem to the gullible colonel that she had been in the same convent as his first wife, and, despite being much younger, had received many signs of her esteem and regard. "If, mademoiselle," said Mrs. Henderson, "you were my mother's friend, then you must be worthy of the esteem of all good-hearted people." "Mademoiselle will soon bring honor to our family," said Rivera, "by filling the void left by that valuable woman. And since you are married, my dear, I don't think you will find fault with—" "Hush, my dear sir," replied Mrs. Henderson. "I know my duty too well to scrutinize your behavior. Rest assured, my dear father, your happiness is mine. I will rejoice in it and genuinely love the person who contributes to it. But tell me," she continued, turning to Valerie, "who is this lovely girl? Is she your sister, mademoiselle?" Valerie blushed, her cheeks turning as red as a rose. "She's a young lady," replied the colonel, "who came on the same ship from England as us." He then pulled his daughter aside and whispered to her that Valerie was Montraville's girlfriend. Mrs. Henderson, with a sympathetic look, softly said, "What a shame, but I'm sure she's not morally corrupt. Her genuine kindness is evident in her honest face." Valerie caught the word shame. "Have I already sunk so low?" she asked. A sigh escaped her, and a tear threatened to fall. But when Montraville appeared, she held back her emotions. Miss went with the colonel and his daughter to another room. Valerie stayed with Montraville and Bellecour. The next morning, the colonel kept his promise, and Larue became Mrs. Rivera in a proper ceremony.